"Ma'am, this hotel is reserved for paying guests." The words landed harder than the cold rain tapping against the glass facade of the Brooks Grand Hotel. For a moment, the revolving door slowed behind Danielle Brooks as she stood perfectly still beneath the warm glow of the entrance lights. Water dripped from the edge of her charcoal coat. A small carry-on suitcase rested beside her. To everyone watching, she looked like a tired traveler who had taken the wrong turn. To the man standing in front of her, she looked like someone who did not belong. Richard Whitmore adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and offered the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Around them, the lobby shimmered with luxury. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden reflections across polished marble floors. A grand piano played softly from the far side of the room. Guests carrying designer luggage moved through the lobby wrapped in the comfort of wealth and routine. Danielle glanced around quietly. Nothing on her face revealed emotion. Not frustration. Not anger. Not surprise. If anything, she looked thoughtful. "I have a reservation," she said calmly. Richard barely looked at her. His attention had already moved to the next guest approaching the entrance. "I'm sure there are several hotels nearby with availability." A few people slowed their pace. One businessman carrying a leather briefcase paused near the concierge desk. A couple waiting for valet service exchanged curious glances. Danielle reached into her coat pocket and handed over her identification. The movement was slow and deliberate. Richard accepted it with visible reluctance. His eyes scanned the card for less than 2 seconds before he handed it back. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Danielle studied him carefully. The rain outside intensified, streaking down the massive glass windows overlooking the city. Somewhere above, thunder rolled across the evening sky. "Is there?" she asked. Richard folded his arms. "Our guests expect a certain standard." The words hung in the air. Several employees behind the front desk suddenly became very interested in their computer screens. A young receptionist named Emily. Carter felt her stomach tighten. She had only worked at the hotel for 4 months, but she had seen this expression before. Richard always decided who belonged before learning who they actually were. Danielle noticed Emily's discomfort. She noticed everything. The nervous glance. The silence. The fear of speaking up. She had seen it before in other hotels. Other cities. Other inspections. What nobody in the lobby knew was that Danielle Brooks had spent the previous 6 weeks traveling across the country without announcing a single visit. 12 properties. 12 anonymous inspections. 12 chances to discover what happened when employees thought nobody important was watching. Richard took a step toward the entrance and gestured toward the sidewalk. "I'm going to ask you one final time, ma'am." The piano music seemed to fade. Conversations grew quieter. Even the concierge stopped typing. Danielle looked past Richard toward the towering hotel logo mounted above the reception desk. Her name was engraved into that company. Her family's legacy was built into every stone of the building. Yet not one person recognized her. Slowly, she picked up her suitcase and walked toward a chair in the center of the lobby. Richard frowned. Danielle sat down beneath the chandelier, crossed her hands, and pulled out her phone. Then she sent a single text message. 9 minutes. That was all she needed. And before those 9 minutes were over, the entire hotel was about to learn exactly who she was. The text message disappeared from Danielle's screen in less than a second. She slipped her phone back into her coat pocket and settled deeper into the chair as though she had nowhere else to be. Around her, the lobby continued moving, but not quite normally. People were watching now. Some tried to pretend they were not. Others openly glanced in her direction whenever they thought she was not looking. The soft piano melody drifted across the marble floor, mixing with the distant sound of rain against the glass walls. Richard Whitmore remained near the entrance, speaking quietly with security while occasionally looking toward Danielle. To him, the situation was already finished. She had been denied entry. She had been told to leave. Any reasonable person would have walked away by now. That was exactly what made her presence so irritating. Emily Carter stood behind the reception desk, pretending to organize reservation files. In reality, she could not stop thinking about the woman sitting beneath the chandelier. There was something unusual about her calmness. Most people became defensive when embarrassed in public. Some became angry. Others demanded managers or threatened lawsuits. This woman had done none of those things. She simply waited. Emily finally leaned toward a coworker. "Do you think she is really staying?" she whispered. The coworker shrugged. Richard already made his decision. Emily looked toward Danielle again. The woman seemed completely unaffected by the whispers surrounding her. Her eyes moved slowly across the lobby, studying details most guests would never notice. The condition of the furniture, the posture of employees, the interaction between staff and guests. It was almost as if she were conducting an invisible inspection. In a way, she was. 6 weeks earlier, Danielle Brooks had received a report that bothered her more than declining profits or maintenance expenses ever could. Customer complaints. Not about dirty rooms. Not about slow service. Complaints about dignity. Complaints about guests being judged before they were welcomed. Complaints about employees being afraid to challenge bad decisions. The numbers had been small at first, easy to dismiss. But Danielle had built her company on one principle. Every guest mattered. The moment people forgot that principle, the company itself would begin to fail. Instead of announcing corporate audits, she had quietly booked flights and visited properties herself. Denver, Atlanta, Dallas, Phoenix, Miami. Most locations passed. A few revealed cracks. This hotel worried her the most. A sudden burst of laughter near the concierge desk pulled Danielle back to the present. A wealthy guest was sharing a story with friends while a bellman loaded expensive luggage onto a cart. Everything looked perfect on the surface. That was the problem. Appearances were easy. Character was harder. Richard walked across the lobby toward the reception desk. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble. "Has she left yet?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "No, sir." His jaw tightened. "Interesting." Danielle noticed the exchange immediately. She checked the time on her watch. 3 minutes had passed. 6 remained. Outside, lightning flashed briefly behind thick storm clouds. The city skyline glowed through the rain like scattered gold across dark water. Then something unexpected happened. A black luxury sedan pulled up beneath the hotel entrance canopy. One valet straightened instantly. Another employee whispered something under his breath. Richard followed their gaze toward the front doors. The expression on his face changed for the first time that evening. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. And uncertainty was something Richard Whitmore was not accustomed to feeling. The sedan remained parked beneath the entrance canopy while rain rolled across its dark windows in shimmering waves. No one stepped out immediately. That alone was unusual. At a hotel like this, important guests rarely waited. Employees rushed to them. Doors opened before hands reached for handles. Yet this vehicle sat motionless as if whoever was inside already knew exactly what was happening in the lobby. Richard Whitmore felt a strange tightness settle in his chest. He could not explain it. He simply did not like surprises. Especially not after the uncomfortable scene that had unfolded over the past few minutes. He glanced at his watch. For minutes, the woman was still there. Across the lobby, Danielle Brooks remained seated beneath the chandelier. Her posture had not changed. Her expression remained calm. She watched the entrance with quiet patience while guests continued stealing curious glances in her direction. Emily noticed it too. Danielle did not look worried. She looked prepared. The realization sent a chill through her. Before she could think further, the front door slid open. 2 men entered first. Both wore dark business suits and carried leather portfolios. The older one had silver hair and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions worth millions of dollars. Several employees immediately recognized him. A valet nearly dropped a luggage tag. The concierge straightened so quickly he almost knocked over a display stand. Emily's eyes widened. She knew exactly who the man was. Marcus Reed, Chief Financial Officer of Brooks Hospitality. She had seen his photograph in corporate newsletters and executive reports. He was one of the most powerful people in the entire company. Richard noticed the reaction from his staff and forced a smile onto his face. Finally, a familiar situation. Corporate visitors were nothing new. He adjusted his tie and began walking toward the entrance. "Mr. Reed," he called confidently. What an unexpected pleasure. Marcus barely looked at him. His eyes moved across the lobby with purpose, scanning faces, tables, and seating areas. Then he saw Danielle. Everything about him changed. He immediately altered direction and walked straight past Richard without slowing down. The smile on Richard's face faltered. Several guests turned to watch. The piano player missed a note. Danielle rose from her chair just as Marcus reached her. For a brief moment, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. Then Marcus extended his hand respectfully. "Good evening, Ms. Brooks," he said. Silence. Complete silence. The words echoed through the marble lobby louder than any shout ever could. Emily felt her stomach drop. One receptionist covered her mouth. A bellman froze beside a luggage cart. Richard stood perfectly still. The color slowly drained from his face. Danielle accepted the handshake with a warm smile. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Marcus." "The moment I received your message," he replied. Behind him, more executives entered through the front doors. Regional directors, operations managers, human resources leaders, one after another. Their presence transformed the atmosphere instantly. Guests who had been whispering moments earlier now stared openly. Danielle looked around the room. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with disappointment. Her gaze settled briefly on Richard before moving across the employees behind the desk. She saw fear, confusion, regret. Most importantly, she saw people beginning to understand what had happened. Marcus glanced toward Richard. "Would you like the board conference room prepared, Ms. Brooks?" Danielle slowly nodded. "Yes," she said. "I believe it is time we discuss what I learned during my visit." Richard swallowed hard. Because deep down, he already knew this meeting was not going to be about hotel profits, occupancy rates, or customer surveys. It was going to be about something far more important. No one spoke as the group moved toward the executive conference floor. The silence followed them like a shadow. Employees stepped aside. Guests watched from across the lobby. The soft piano music continued somewhere behind them, but it felt distant now, almost unreal. Danielle Brooks walked at the front beside Marcus Reed, her small carry-on suitcase rolling quietly across the polished floor. Richard Whitmore followed several steps behind. Every click of his shoes against the marble seemed louder than the last. For years, he had entered executive meetings with confidence. Tonight felt different. The private elevator opened with a soft chime. Danielle stepped inside first. Marcus and the executives followed. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before entering. The doors closed. No one spoke during the ride. The city lights shimmered through the glass wall of the elevator as rain streaked down the outside of the building. 27 floors below, the hotel lobby continued operating. Guests checked in. Bellmen moved luggage. Housekeepers prepared rooms. Yet something had already changed. Word was spreading. By the time the elevator reached the executive level, several employees had already begun texting one another. The conference room overlooked the entire downtown skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a sea of lights stretching for miles through the storm. A long walnut table sat beneath elegant pendant lighting. Everything about the room communicated authority. Danielle slowly walked to the head of the table. She placed her suitcase beside her chair and looked around. Regional directors, department leaders, human resources specialists, operations executives. Every seat filled quickly. Richard remained standing near the far end of the room. He felt as though every eye was on him. Danielle folded her hands calmly. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Her voice was gentle, but it carried effortlessly through the room. Marcus nodded respectfully. No one interrupted. "For the past 6 weeks," Danielle continued, "I have visited 12 properties across our company without announcing my arrival." Several executives exchanged glances. A few had suspected something. None had known the full extent of her inspection. Danielle looked toward the rain-covered windows before continuing. "I did not travel to review profit margins. I did not travel to review occupancy rates. I traveled to answer a simple question." The room remained silent. How do we treat people when we believe nobody important is watching? The question lingered in the air. Richard felt his throat tighten. Danielle slowly turned her gaze toward him. Not with anger, not with hostility, with disappointment. Somehow that felt worse. "This evening," she said, "I entered the front doors of this hotel carrying a valid reservation under my own name." Several executives immediately looked down at their notes. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Danielle continued, "I was never asked how I could be helped. I was never welcomed. No one attempted to verify my reservation properly. Instead, assumptions were made before facts were gathered." The words landed heavily across the room. Marcus opened a folder and slid several documents onto the table. Customer complaint reports, employee surveys, internal observations, months of warning signs. Danielle nodded toward them. What happened tonight was not an isolated incident. A low murmur spread through the room before quickly fading. Richard finally found his voice. "Ms. Brooks, I never intended." Danielle gently raised her hand. He immediately stopped speaking. Intentions matter, she said quietly. But impact matters more. Outside, another flash of lightning illuminated the skyline. The room briefly glowed white before settling back into soft amber light. Danielle took a slow breath. Then she opened her suitcase. Inside was a thick binder filled with handwritten notes from every property she had visited. She placed it on the table. Tonight is not about punishment, she said. It is about truth. And as the executives looked at the hundreds of pages she had personally compiled, many of them began to realize this meeting was about to become far bigger than a single manager's mistake. The binder sat in the center of the conference table like a silent witness. No one reached for it at first. The pages inside represented 6 weeks of observations, conversations, and uncomfortable truths. Rain continued tapping against the glass walls overlooking the city, creating a steady rhythm beneath the silence that filled the room. Danielle Brooks slowly opened the cover and turned to the first section. Color-coded tabs divided the reports by location. Handwritten notes filled the margins. Names, dates, observations, and comments appeared on nearly every page. This was not the work of a distant executive reading spreadsheets from an office. This was the work of someone who had walked the hallways, sat in the lobbies, and listened. I met housekeepers who felt invisible, Danielle said quietly. I met front desk employees who wanted to do the right thing, but felt pressured to stay silent. I met guests who never filed complaints because they believed no one would listen. No one interrupted. Marcus Reed remained focused on the binder while the other executives listened carefully. Danielle turned another page. At one property, a family was treated differently because staff assumed they could not afford a suite. At another, a returning guest was questioned repeatedly despite being a loyalty member for over 8 years. The room grew heavier with every example. None of the incidents alone would have made national headlines. None would have triggered an emergency board meeting. But together they revealed a pattern, a culture. Richard Whitmore stared at the table. The confidence he had carried into the evening was gone. For the first time, he realized the problem was larger than a single interaction in the lobby. Danielle had not come searching for one mistake. She had come searching for the truth behind many small decisions that happened every day. Decisions people stopped noticing because they had become routine. Danielle looked toward the executives seated around the room. Do you know what surprised me most? She asked. No one answered. The people causing the most harm were rarely the people intending to do harm. Several heads slowly lifted. Danielle continued. Most believed they were protecting standards, protecting procedures, protecting the brand. But when protecting an image becomes more important than respecting a person, something has gone terribly wrong. The words landed with quiet force. Across the table, the vice president of operations slowly nodded. He had spent years studying performance reports and customer satisfaction surveys. Yet none of those reports measured the moment a guest felt unwelcome. Danielle turned another page. A photograph slid onto the table. Then another. Then another. Pictures from different hotels, different cities, different employees, all interacting with guests. Some positive, some concerning. Every picture tells a story, Danielle said. But numbers alone never reveal character. Richard finally lifted his eyes. Ms. Brooks, he said carefully, I understand now that mistakes were made. Danielle studied him for several seconds. The room became perfectly still again. Do you? She asked gently. The question was not hostile. It was honest. Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. Because deep down, he was no longer sure he fully understood. Danielle closed the binder and folded her hands. The easiest thing I could do tonight would be to focus on one person. Her gaze moved briefly toward him before returning to the room. But if I leave this meeting believing one individual is the entire problem, then I have learned nothing. Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances. The conversation was shifting. This was no longer about blame. It was about responsibility. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken. The rain softened against the glass. Far below, city traffic flowed through reflections of red and white lights. Danielle looked toward the skyline before turning back to the room. The real question is not what happened tonight, she said. The real question is why so many people watched it happen and believed it was normal. And as those words settled across the conference table, nobody could look away from the uncomfortable truth they revealed. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The conference room seemed suspended in time. Beyond the glass walls, the storm clouds were beginning to drift apart, revealing scattered lights across the city below. Danielle Brooks stood and slowly walked toward the windows. Her reflection moved across the dark glass, framed by the fading rain and the distant glow of traffic. The room watched her in silence. Marcus Reed closed the binder gently. No one reached for a phone. No one checked a watch. Even the executives who had entered expecting a routine corporate discussion now understood they were witnessing something far more important. Danielle rested one hand lightly against the cool glass and looked down at the streets nearly 30 stories below. Tiny headlights moved through the darkness like streams of white and red stars. When my father opened his first hotel, she said softly, he only had 20 rooms. Her voice was calm, almost reflective. The carpet was outdated. The furniture was secondhand. The sign outside flickered whenever it rained. A few faint smiles appeared around the table. Danielle continued, but every guest who walked through those doors was greeted exactly the same way. My father used to tell me that people remember how you make them feel long after they forget what the lobby looked like. The room remained still. Richard listened carefully. For the first time that evening, he was no longer focused on defending himself. He was listening, truly listening. Danielle turned away from the window and looked around the table. Some of the best employees I met during these 6 weeks worked in the smallest properties. Some had never received awards. Some would never appear in executive presentations. She smiled faintly, but they saw people. They welcomed them. They treated them with dignity. Her eyes settled briefly on Emily Carter, whose image appeared in one of the employee reports projected onto a nearby screen. Earlier that evening, Emily had remained silent. Yet Danielle remembered something else. She remembered the concern in the young receptionist's eyes. She remembered that Emily had looked uncomfortable while others ignored what was happening. Small details mattered. Character often revealed itself in quiet moments. Culture is not created in boardrooms, Danielle continued. It is created one conversation at a time, one guest at a time, one decision at a time. The words settled over the room like a gentle weight. Outside, the final traces of rain slid down the glass. The city seemed brighter now, cleaner somehow. Richard lowered his eyes. The realization growing inside him was uncomfortable. He had spent years protecting the image of excellence while overlooking the very thing excellence required. Respect, humanity, humility. Danielle returned to her chair and closed the binder completely. The sound echoed softly across the table. Tonight, she said, I learned something encouraging. Several executives looked surprised. Encouraging was not the word they expected. Danielle smiled gently. The problem is real, but it can be fixed. A quiet breath seemed to pass through the room. Hope where tension had been. Possibility where fear had lived. Marcus nodded slowly. Yet Danielle's expression remained thoughtful, because one important decision still remained. And as everyone waited to hear what would happen next, Richard realized the future of more than one career was about to be decided. The room remained silent after Danielle's final words. No one moved. No one reached for the coffee cups sitting untouched along the conference table. The city lights beyond the windows shimmered against the damp glass, casting soft reflections across the polished wood surface. Richard Whitmore sat perfectly still. For the first time in many years, he felt stripped of every title that had once made him feel secure. General manager, executive leader, industry veteran. None of those labels mattered in this moment. Danielle Brooks opened a thin folder Marcus had quietly placed beside her. Unlike the thick binder of observations, this folder contained only a few pages. She studied them, briefly before looking up. Marcus, she said calmly, how many guest complaints regarding treatment and respect were filed from this property over the last 18 months? Marcus adjusted his glasses and reviewed the report. 37 documented complaints, he answered. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Danielle nodded. And how many resulted in corrective action? Marcus looked down again. The pause felt longer this time. 3. A murmur moved through the room before fading quickly. Danielle closed the folder. The answer confirmed what she already suspected. Problems had been reported. Warnings had existed. Opportunities to improve had been missed. Richard lowered his gaze. The numbers felt heavier than any accusation. Danielle slowly stood and walked toward the far side of the room. I want to show you something, she said. Marcus pressed a button on a remote. A photograph appeared on the large presentation screen. It showed a smiling elderly couple standing beside a hotel employee in Denver. Another image appeared, a housekeeper helping a confused traveler find a conference room. Then another, a bellman kneeling beside a young child to help tie a loose shoelace before a family wedding. The room watched quietly. These employees received no awards, Danielle said. Most of them never met senior leadership. Yet they understood something essential. More photographs appeared. Genuine moments. Human moments. Small acts of kindness that cost nothing and changed everything. Danielle turned toward the room. Hospitality is not marble floors. It is not chandeliers. It is not luxury suites. Her voice remained soft. Hospitality is making people feel welcome before you know who they are. The words seemed to strike something deep inside Richard. Suddenly, he remembered the young version of himself decades earlier. A front desk clerk working overnight shifts. A man who once believed every guest deserved respect. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing people and started seeing appearances. The realization hit harder than any professional consequence ever could. Slowly, Richard rose from his chair. Every eye in the room turned toward him. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. I understand now. Danielle studied him carefully. What do you understand? She asked. Richard swallowed. That I never really looked at the person standing in front of me. The room fell silent once again. Danielle did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the conference table at every executive, every manager, every leader present. Then she nodded once. Not because the problem was solved. Not because everything was forgiven. But because for the first time that evening, someone had finally spoken the truth. And deep down, everyone in the room knew that what happened next would determine the future of the entire company. For a long moment, no one spoke after Richard's admission. The conference room felt different now. The tension that had filled the space earlier had softened into something quieter and far more difficult to ignore. Reflection, accountability, truth. Danielle Brooks remained standing near the head of the table, her eyes moving from one face to another. Outside, the storm had finally passed. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing patches of clear night sky above the city. The lights below seemed brighter than before. Marcus Reed closed the presentation on the screen and folded his hands. Every executive waited for Danielle's decision. Richard remained standing. He did not attempt to justify himself. He did not offer excuses. The confidence that once defined him had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Humility. Danielle slowly returned to her chair and sat down. Her expression remained calm. When I was 23 years old, she said quietly, I worked the front desk at one of our smallest properties. Several executives looked surprised. Some had never heard the story before. Danielle smiled faintly. One evening, an older woman walked into the lobby carrying 2 plastic shopping bags. Her clothes were simple. Her shoes were worn. One employee assumed she could not afford a room. Danielle paused. The room listened carefully. That woman turned out to be one of our largest investors. A few people exchanged glances. Danielle shook her head gently. But that is not the important part. Her eyes settled on Richard. The important part is that she deserved respect before anyone knew who she was. Silence returned. The lesson landed deeper than any policy ever could. Danielle folded her hands on the table. Tonight was never about catching someone in a mistake. Richard looked up slowly. It was about discovering whether our values still exist when nobody is watching. Marcus nodded quietly. Several executives did the same. Danielle turned toward the human resources director. Beginning tomorrow, every manager in this company will complete leadership retraining focused on culture, respect, and guest experience. Pens immediately began moving across notepads. Every property will be reviewed. Every complaint will be examined. Every employee will have a direct channel to report concerns without fear. The room came alive with focused attention. Action, change, progress. Danielle then looked directly at Richard. The room grew silent once more. As for you, she said. Richard straightened slightly. You have spent years helping this hotel achieve financial success. He nodded quietly. But leadership requires more than performance metrics. Danielle let the words settle. You cannot lead people if you stop seeing them. Richard lowered his eyes. I understand. Danielle studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. Good. The answer surprised everyone. There was no anger in her voice. No desire for humiliation. Only a commitment to growth. Richard felt something unexpected rise in his chest. Gratitude. Because Danielle had chosen a harder path than punishment. She had chosen accountability. Around the table, executives began to realize the true lesson of the evening. Power was not demonstrated through revenge. It was demonstrated through wisdom. Danielle stood once more and looked toward the city lights beyond the glass. We build hotels, she said softly. But what people remember is how we make them feel. And as those words echoed through the room, every person present understood that the future of the company had just begun to change. 1 week later, the morning sun poured through the massive glass windows of the hotel lobby, washing the marble floors in warm gold light. The storm that had covered the city 7 nights earlier felt like a distant memory. Guests moved through the entrance carrying coffee cups, rolling suitcases, and conference folders. Soft piano music drifted through the air once again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Lighter, warmer, more human. Small changes had appeared throughout the property. New training sessions had already begun. Managers spent more time on the lobby floor instead of hidden inside offices. Employees greeted guests with greater confidence. Most importantly, people were paying attention to one another. Not because corporate leadership demanded it, because they finally understood why it mattered. Emily Carter stood behind the reception desk, helping an elderly couple check into their room. She smiled as she handed them their key cards and personally walked around the desk to point them toward the elevators. The couple thanked her warmly before continuing on their way. As Emily returned to her station, her eyes drifted toward the entrance. A familiar black sedan had just arrived beneath the canopy. This time, however, there was no confusion, no uncertainty, no hesitation. The doors opened and Danielle Brooks stepped into the lobby. Conversation softened almost immediately. Employees noticed her arrival and straightened instinctively. Yet what happened next surprised her. Nobody rushed. Nobody panicked. Nobody performed for appearances. They simply welcomed her. Naturally. Sincerely. Exactly as they should welcome any guest. Emily smiled. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks." Danielle returned the smile. "Good morning, Emily." The young receptionist felt a quiet sense of pride. A week earlier, she had remained silent when she should have spoken. Today she was becoming the kind of leader Danielle hoped the company would develop. Danielle slowly walked across the lobby. Sunlight reflected from the crystal chandelier above, scattering tiny points of light across the floor. The same chair where she had once waited alone remained beneath it. For a moment she paused beside it. The memory returned clearly. The rain, the whispers, the assumptions. Then she looked around. The difference was visible everywhere. Marcus Reed approached from the far side of the lobby carrying a folder. "The first employee feedback reports are coming in," he said. "The response has been overwhelmingly positive." Danielle nodded. "Good." Marcus hesitated before adding one more thing. "Richard asked me to thank you." Danielle looked toward the front entrance. Outside, the city was alive with movement beneath a bright blue sky. "For what?" she asked quietly. Marcus smiled. "For reminding him why he started in this business." Danielle said nothing for a moment. Then she looked back across the lobby filled with travelers from different backgrounds, different stories, and different walks of life. People who would likely never know what had happened here a week ago. And that was perfectly fine. Because the lesson had never been about proving who owned the hotel. It had never been about power. It had been about dignity, respect, humanity. Danielle adjusted her coat and began walking toward the elevators. Her footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. No speeches followed. No applause. No grand celebration. Just the quiet sound of a company finding its way back to its values. The morning sunlight continued pouring through the windows as the elevator doors opened. Danielle stepped inside and disappeared from view. The doors closed gently. The lobby carried on. And somehow, that silence felt like the most meaningful victory of all.